A change of perspective. Harold Pritchard, a man of 73, sat in his favorite armchair, gazing out at the garden that his late wife, Margaret, had tended to with such care. The roses were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dullness of Harold's thoughts. He'd heard it said many times, when you have more years behind you than ahead of you, you think about things differently. It was supposed to be profound, but to Harold, it just seemed like a sad reminder of the inevitable. He had always been a practical man, an accountant by trade, and numbers were his comfort. He'd spent his life tallying up expenses, calculating risks, and ensuring everything balanced perfectly. But now, with the scales tipped heavily towards the past, he found himself reflecting on the years he could no longer add up. One morning, Harold decided to take a walk through the garden. As he shuffled past the rose bushes, something caught his eye, a small, delicate flower he'd never noticed before. It was hidden among the larger blooms, a tiny purple blossom that seemed almost shy in its beauty. Harold bent down, wincing as his joints protested, and peered at the flower. "Where did you come from?" he muttered to himself. It was strange, in all his years, he'd never seen this flower. He'd always been focused on the roses, the tulips, the plants that everyone noticed. But here was this little blossom, quietly existing in the shadow of the grander blooms. As Harold straightened up, a thought struck him. Perhaps this was what it meant to think differently. Maybe it wasn't about mourning the lost years or regretting the things left undone. Maybe it was about noticing the small things he'd overlooked in his pursuit of the grand. He'd spent his life calculating the big numbers, but now, with more years behind him, it was time to appreciate the decimals. Harold began spending more time in the garden, seeking out the hidden flowers, the overlooked beauty in the corners. He found joy in the details, the small wonders that he'd once dismissed as unimportant. And as the days passed, he realized that thinking differently didn't mean dwelling on the past or fearing the future. It meant seeing the present with new eyes. One afternoon, Harold sat by the little purple flower, a smile on his face. The sun was warm on his skin, and the scent of roses filled the air. He no longer worried about the years ahead or behind. For the first time in a long time, Harold was simply content to be here, now, in the garden. And in that moment, he understood, when you have more years behind you than ahead of you, you don't just think about things differently, you start noticing the things you never thought to think about at all.